This works. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. I really am happy to see such a great turnout at what looks to be an incredible festival. So thank you very much. So a little quick introduction. I have been an investigative reporter for 25 years at major American newspapers, most recently the Washington Post, where I still do stories for the investigative team. And over 20-some years as an investigative reporter, I really focused on the worst in human nature. Imagine that: corruption, greed, incompetence, mismanagement. So I've written about cities and counties and federal agencies that promise to deliver programs to serve the poor and never produced. I've written about nonprofit groups that promise to help people with HIV and AIDS, never produced. I've written about affordable housing developers that promise to use government money to build homes from the poor, never produced. So this is what I've been doing for 25 years. But as an investigative reporter, I look for what's gone wrong. As a nonfiction author, I look for people who move and inspire me. Essentially, I look for the best in human nature. I look for ordinary people that do extraordinary things in the face of great adversity. And so it's been a really nice, for me as a writer and a journalist, a great change of pace to look for people that are doing good things in this world and not just people and agencies and programs that kind of mess up. So that is a little bit about me. I've worked at the Miami Herald and the Washington Post, and I spent a long time in North Carolina. And then I turned to writing books, and I am here at Northwestern as the director of investigative reporting for Medill. Just started 6 weeks ago. Incredible program. Oh, thank you. So this search for the story behind the story is what led me to my latest book, Citizen 865. It got started at the dawn of 2016 at a New Year's Eve party in Maryland, where I live. And I was at this party, and as we all do in our 40s, 50s, and 60s, we thought we were super cool, dancing to disco music all night long. And I got into a conversation with a woman who happened to be an attorney, a prosecutor for the US Department of Justice. And though I had spent 12 or so years in Washington, D.C., I had never heard of this tiny little unit inside the Department of Justice called the Office of Special Investigations. And over this long, intense conversation at this New Year's Eve party, Robin Gold told me about the mission of this unit, which was to hunt Nazi war criminals who slipped into the United States in the years after the war. They were essentially hiding in plain sight in America's cities and suburbs. And this unit was set up by Congress to hunt them down, to denaturalize them, and ultimately to deport them back to Germany, Austria, or other countries in Eastern Europe. And I had no idea this unit existed. And so Robin and I spent about 3 hours talking over the dinner table at New Year's Eve about the Office of Special Investigations. And I looked at the clock, it was after midnight. I realized I had a husband who was there. I went to look for him, sitting out on the stoop, reading his iPhone, waiting for me. But I told him, it's okay, Jeff, because it's leading to my next book, and I know that this is what I want to write about. And so within a couple of days, I knew I had a book. I knew I had a story. I really wanted to know two things. Number one, how was it possible that 70-some years after the end of the war, we had on US soil Nazi collaborators, commandants of concentration camps, men who essentially served as Hitler's helpers, living here in the United States among not only Holocaust survivors and their children, but also among war veterans who had crossed an ocean to save them, to free them. How was it possible that in the United States, we had these men, and in some cases women, living here openly in our communities? The other thing I wanted to know was, who were the people inside the Office of Special Investigations, inside the criminal division of the Justice Department, who had dedicated their entire professional careers to hunting these collaborators down? And what is it like to live inside some of the war's darkest moments, day after day, month after month? How do you live in that place, in that space, talking to survivors, but not just survivors, but to killers, which is probably worse than talking in some ways to survivors, to hear a killer talk in such technical terms about mass murder. How do you live in that place day after day, month after month, year after year, and still go home and have dinner with your wife or your husband, and rock a newborn to sleep, and take your kid to the soccer game, and take an anniversary trip? How do you separate yourself from that kind of darkness and go on to live your life? And so I was fascinated by these men and women who gave up, in some careers as lawyers in the private sector, to take on this hunt for Nazis on US soil. And I wasn't just interested in the prosecutors. I was really interested in the historians who worked behind the scenes to find these men. I think I was interested because I'm an investigative reporter, so I relate to the idea of digging up dusty records that no one has ever seen, and finding these records in the archives of Eastern Europe scattered all over the place, finding Nazi rosters and all kinds of stuff. And I was really, really fascinated with the historians who did this work, because one thing I know now, having written this book about history, is that it's not good enough to know what happened between 1939 and 1945. You have to have context in order to create, in order to bring Nazi perpetrators to justice. These people, the Department of Justice, had to recreate the world of Nazi Germany. They had to understand the way it worked. They had to know the context so that they could successfully denaturalize and ultimately deport these men. And so I started on this book project, and I really found at the end of my journey that this book wasn't just about darkness. It was also about light. It's really about the pursuit of Nazi war criminals on US soil and what it means to have justice, even delayed justice. In this case, it was 50, 60, 70 years delayed. And why this matters today in our world. And it matters, as we all know, because we're too often confronted with hate and intolerance and anti-Semitism and this us versus them mentality, and it leads to violence. And so this kind of justice matters even today. And so I wrote this book thinking, gosh, I'm going to live in some dark moments with these guys. But really, at the end of the day, I was feeling very hopeful and very inspired. So other books have been written about the Office of Special Investigations. Just to give you a little bit of context, this little-known unit in this obscure wing of the Justice Department with offices that face a McDonald's and frayed carpeting and drop ceilings with water stains and you name it, just your classic rundown, shabby government office, was home for a long, long time to these prosecutors and to these historians. And over about 30 years, they tracked down more than 100 Nazi collaborators who were living on US soil, and they deported many of them back to Germany. And that is their greatest accomplishment. And so other books have been written about this unit. Some of you might have heard the name John Demjanjuk, right? Yeah, so he was one of the people that they successfully prosecuted, unsuccessfully the first time, successfully the second time. But I wasn't interested so much in the broad mission of the unit as I was in one particular investigation, and that is the search for the men of Travniki. And so in the West, even people who know a lot about the war had never really heard of Travniki, and in fact, even historians here in the United States knew that Travniki existed, but they didn't understand the scope of Travniki or its role in Operation Reinhardt, which was the Nazi plan to exterminate the Jews of occupied Poland. And so I really like this idea of, well, what is Travniki, and how is it that 50, 60, 70 years after the war, we've never heard of Travniki? So this is what I decided to study, and this is the subject of the book. So Poland, as you probably know, was home to millions of Jews before the war. And there was the idea that what are we going to do with the Jews of Poland? How are we going to relocate the Jews of Poland? And so a man named Odilio Gubladnik, the SS commander who had been appointed by Himmler to eradicate the Jews of Poland, was absolutely fascinated with the idea of gasings, of mobile gas vans that the Germans had used in Germany to...
Yeah, you finish them off.
And so armed with this information, they had confessions, they had rosters and records from Prague and from all over Eastern Europe. They took Jacob Reimer to court in New York, and they sought to strip him of his citizenship and ultimately deport him. They were successful at the first part. They were able to strip him of his citizenship. It took the judge 4 years to rule on this case, and the people at OSI believe that the judge wanted to just wait it out so that Jacob Reimer got to die on US soil in peace. And so it was a 4-year wait until he was ultimately deported. And at the end of the day, Jacob Reimer got to die on US soil because before they could deport him, he died in Pennsylvania. In fact, Germany had already refused to take him back. And a number of Travniki men were able to die on US soil because of this pushback, because of the blowback. But ultimately, OSI and the Justice Department felt that justice had been done. To the extent that they could see justice done, it had been done because the record of Travniki, the history of this school for mass murder, became part of the public record. It was memorialized in a federal court. And Jacob Reimer ultimately lost his citizenship, and he spent the rest of his life as a stateless man. But they couldn't get him deported because Germany wouldn't do it. So for me as a writer, as I said at the beginning, I came away with this having written this story about darkness, but I came away from this story feeling hopeful and surprised. For a number of reasons. One, though I had studied the Holocaust in college and as a kid and as a grown-up, I didn't quite realize how many people it takes to kill, how many millions of collaborators there had to be for the Third Reich to kill that many people. George Will, in covering the Jacob Reimer trial, called it cogs in a wheel, cogs in a wheel. You can't kill 1.7 million people in fewer than 24 months without having a massive operation, without having a lot of people on the ground willing to help you out in one capacity or another. I also found it fascinating that the Germans were able to indoctrinate the enemy so quickly and so successfully. Jacob Reimer was able to take paid vacations as a Travniki man, go home to see his family in Soviet Ukraine without, even though he had been a recruit, technically a prisoner of the Nazis, and he was able to go home, and he still came back to Travniki to serve the Third Reich. And so to me, some of the Travniki men deserted, but so many of them stayed on. And it was fascinating to me to think, why? Why wouldn't you just try to run if you can? If you have the possibility to desert, why not desert? Because they received paid vacations, they received health benefits, they received death benefits. Jacob Reimer in 1944 was made a citizen of Nazi Germany, so he was essentially promised a future in this utopia in Germany. And so it was, even though he was indoctrinated, I was still fascinated that many, many more didn't run when they had the chance to run. I was also moved as a journalist, as a mother, as a Jewish woman, as a human being by the power and the will to survive, and how sometimes through luck, through strategy, through just sheer effort, the will to survive can trump the best efforts of evil men. And so I'll tell you the epilogue to the Felix and Lucinia story, and I always tear up, so I'll do it again, I'm sure. But they were able to come to the United States. Felix became a doctor, served many generations of children, had a family of their own, and had grandchildren. And I am so honored to tell you they're here today. Would you please rise? And Lucinia often said, where once there was nothing, look what I built. Look what I built. So I was so honored that they let me share their parents' story in this book. It really meant a lot. It really meant a lot to me. And that is probably the biggest reason why I say Citizen 865 is a story about darkness, but it's also about light. And I think the message here in this world right now, with what we're seeing here and abroad, is more relevant and more critical now than at any other time in recent history. So I hope you'll pick up a copy of the book at some point. I'd love to know that we're getting this message out. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Debbie. We're going to go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. Before we get started, though, please, a few things. Do speak into the microphone so that everyone can hear. Please keep your question brief so that we can get to everyone. And don't forget to pose your question as a question and not a statement. So we've got mics circulating on either side of the room. Go ahead and raise your hand, and Hallie and I will come to you with the microphone. Let's start right back here in the middle. We're going to pass the microphone to you, sir.
Thank you. I'm curious, did the people from Trawniki in the United States keep their original names? How available were they to be found?
Yeah, that's a great question. No, they took on American names. So Jacob Reimer became Jack Reimer. You know, they definitely took on American names. They were able to find them initially through all kinds of different ways. They didn't really know they were here, but they might have been searching or investigating another concentration camp, commandant, and then they got some names this way, and they thought, well, who are these guys? But they knew they were here. They just didn't necessarily know how to prove a case. So one of the last known Travniki men was named Jackie Pauley. He lived in Queens, New York, on this little middle-class street in Queens, New York, for more than 50 years. And 14 or 15 years ago, a judge ordered him deported. He was denaturalized and deported because he, like Jacob Reimer, had helped liquidate the Lublin ghetto and also served as a guard at Travniki when the Germans shot 7,000 Jewish prisoners, essentially every Jewish person who was in a forced labor camp next to Travniki. So even though Jackie Pauley had been ordered deported 14 years ago, the Germans would not take him back. And only last year, the Trump White House managed to convince Germany to take back Jackie Pauley, and so they deported him at 95 years old. Yeah, he died pretty quickly after he was deported. But they knew in some cases they were here, they just didn't have the evidence to prove it. They just didn't. And in fact, through my reporting process, I was able to retrace the steps of Doctors Black and Dr. White and go back to the archives in Prague and look at the original Nazi rosters that they looked at that really was a breakthrough in this Travniki investigation. They make you put gloves on your hands so that the oil on your fingers don't get on original documents. But they knew they were here. They just needed documents like this. Here you can see Jacob Reimer and his number. That's essentially his dog tag number, issued by the SS. It followed him throughout the war. He was 865, or Citizen 865. But as part of my reporting, I was able to go back and retrace their steps and see what Travniki looked like today.
Great. We've got a question right down here. We're coming to you with the mic.
So I just read a book called The Nazis Next Door. And he talks a lot about the CIA and the FBI bringing people over purposefully to spy on the communists. I was curious what you found when you were doing your research.
Yes, so I'd also read Eric Lichtwell's book, which was a wonderful book. Because he covered that topic, the issue is that there is evidence that was uncovered that the CIA recruited and brought over Nazi scientists in the years after the war. And so Eric Lichtwell, who was a former New York Times reporter, wrote this book, The Nazis Next Door. I stayed away from that subject completely in the book for two reasons. One, it had been written about before. Two, there was some criticism about the book, and I don't want to weigh in on that because I respect Eric's book and he has a new one coming out. But the Office of Special Investigations and the Justice Department disputed some of the statistics in the book. But for me, I stayed away from it mostly because it had been done before. And it didn't apply to the men of Travniki. That's pretty much the biggest reason, yeah.
We've got a question right down here in front.
To what extent were you able to determine when these people came over that the U.S. knew of their role during the Holocaust but let them in anyway?
Yeah, so we did not, U.S. Army investigators and the people who were assigned to admitting displaced people after the war had never heard of Trawniki. They did not know what it was. It was a tiny little farming village in Poland. And so there was almost no way for them to know who they were letting in with these men of Trawniki. Some of them, Jacob Reimer never served in a death camp. He never served in a death camp. He deported people from the Lublin ghetto. He helped suppress the Warsaw Uprising, but he didn't put on his documents Sobibor or Belzec or Treblinka or things that would have raised red flags. In fact, Jacob Reimer had a recommendation from the Red Cross, his Red Cross supervisor, right after he ditched his Trawniki uniform. He went to Munich and got a job with the U.S. in a truck with gas to kill a number of people. So he was fascinated by the idea of bloodless mass murder, highly efficient mass murder. And so they started building death camps, 3 in particular in Poland, not concentration camps. Concentration camps had barracks. There were forced labor sections of concentration camps. Jews and other prisoners could survive there for weeks or months on end, even in horrific conditions. Death camps were built solely for death. There were 3 of them, Belzec and Sobibor and Treblinka. And they were scattered in remote places outside major cities or urban areas in Poland. And Jewish prisoners were essentially taken right from the trains right to the gas chambers. There were no barracks because they died upon entry of these death camps. And so Odilio Gubladnik decided that this would be the most efficient way of getting rid of the Jews of Poland, and there were millions and millions of them. And so he needed manpower. He needed help because all of the Germans were busy fighting on the Soviet front. So he needed help. He needed foot soldiers. And so he did something that was very interesting. He recruited from Soviet POW camps. He pooled Soviet soldiers out of POW camps, and he sent them to this little farming village in Trawniki, Poland, which is just south of Warsaw. And you can see on this map, you can see that Warsaw's to the north. Lublin, which is where the book is based, is kind of in the center, and Trawniki is just kind of south, a little bit south of Lublin. And what you can see on here is Trawniki is linked to the rest of Poland through railway lines. So it was a very strategic location. So what Gubladnik did is he recruited 5,000 men, Eastern European recruits, men who had fought for the enemy, the Soviets. And he brought them to Trawniki, and he trained them at essentially what became a school for mass murder. It was a school for mass murder. He armed them. He empowered them. They listened to Nazi ideology on the loudspeakers. There were some reports that they were forced during training operations to shoot a Jew to prove loyalty to the Third Reich. And so these men who had once fought for the enemy became loyal foot soldiers for the Third Reich. And then they were dispatched or deployed all across occupied Poland to do the dirtiest jobs in the war, the absolute dirtiest jobs in the war. They operated the gas chambers at the 3 killing centers. They helped with very violent, horrific deportation operations from ghettos all across Poland. They fought the uprising during the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. They conducted horrible shooting operations in the woods. And so these men, these Trawniki men or Trawniki guards, were actually known among the Jews of Poland as being more ruthless and more violent than the dreaded SS. They were absolutely vicious. In fact, some Jewish prisoners called them blackies because they were dressed all in black, and they often wore black coats. And the Jewish prisoners didn't know who they were. They just knew that they were Ukrainian, Latvian, Lithuanian. They could tell by their accents. And they knew that they were absolutely more violent in some cases than the SS. And so that was what the Trawniki camp's mission was. And they did all kinds, they went to all over, as I said. They went to, well, I should start here. This is Himmler visiting Trawniki. This was an absolutely critical component of Operation Reinhard, the plan to exterminate the Jews of occupied Poland. Karl Streibel was one of the commandants of the camp. He was a regular drunk, strolled the camp in black leather boots, absolutely violent. And the first place Trawniki men were deployed to was the city of Lublin, which was a thriving cultural hub in Poland for the Jews. Thriving religious cultural hub. Jews served in government offices, they controlled factories. It was this really vibrant community. And then one day, Lublin's 40,000 Jews were put into this ghetto, which was just horrific. As we all know, ghetto starvation, disease, lack of clean water. And in this ghetto, the Trawniki men were deployed on their very first mission. They had to round up about 40,000 Jews, put them on trains that would take them right to the gas chambers of the Belzec killing center. And so the Trawniki guards were told to shoot on the spot, so the elderly and anyone who resisted, the sick, were shot on the spot. They went to the Jewish orphanage, and they shot all of the children and their wards at the orphanage. The adults didn't want to leave the children, so they stayed and died with them. They went to the Jewish hospital, shot and killed all of the patients, along with the doctors, nurses, and staff there. So this was an absolutely bloody mission. They were then deployed all over Poland, including to the Warsaw Ghetto during the uprising. And they worked alongside German police and other fighters to suppress the uprising. Thousands of Jews died, as we know, in the Warsaw Ghetto. Not a lot of pictures of Trawniki guards. It really was not a well-known thing, at least here in the West, for a very long time. One of the pictures that I find most stunning is this one. These are Trawniki men. We can tell by their uniforms standing over the bodies of the dead in the Warsaw Ghetto. So they were a very, very violent force, 5,000 men strong. The historians at the Office of Special Investigations called them the foot soldiers of the Third Reich. Here's one taking a break at the Belzec Extermination Center, playing the mandolin, just to take a little bit of a break. Ultimately, the Trawniki men helped the SS murder 1.7 million Jews in fewer than 20 months. That's the span of 2 Polish summers, 1.7 million Jews. It's almost impossible to wrap your head around, but the Germans could not have done it without the men of Trawniki. This is Citizen 865. This is Jacob Reimer, and he's the subject of the book, one of the subjects of the book. And he was one of the most trusted leaders at Travniki. He's a former POW soldier, recruited, and because he had German language skills, they took this service photo when he started at Travniki. They filled out his service record, and he became a platoon leader at Travniki. And so this is John Demjanjuk, by the way, for those of you who know John Demjanjuk, before he served at the Sobibor killing center, he was a Travniki guard. That is where John Demjanjuk trained, and that is his SS service photo. So what happened to these men after the war? Well, the platoon, as the Soviets were coming in to Poland, the platoon split up. The men ditched their Nazi uniforms or their SS uniforms, ditched their weapons, and they scattered all over Europe. They essentially started hiding in plain sight in Europe for a number of years, but many of them slipped into the United States on the same ships, US ships, naval ships and other ships that brought over other displaced people from Europe, including Jewish survivors, brought over these Travniki men, including Jacob Reimer, John Demjanjuk, and at least 14 others that we know of. One was just deported from Queens, New York last year in 2018. So these men were able to come over to the United States and essentially form lives in middle-class America. Jacob Reimer, who we just saw, actually became a wise potato chip salesman in New York City. John Demjanjuk, I think, worked at an auto for Ford or car dealers, car manufacturing. So they lived in plain sight. They had Social Security cards, they had pensions, they went to church, they got married, they became naturalized citizens here in the United States, and they really looked like the most ordinary Americans. And they lived that way essentially in peace. Many of them never saw the inside of a courtroom, never had a traffic ticket, nothing. They lived that way for years until the Office of Special Investigations, especially this historian, Peter Black, realized that they were here. So how did he find out? What do you do? How do you start investigating? One of the biggest obstacles that they faced was that most of the records were locked behind lock and key in the archives behind the Iron Curtain. They couldn't actually get to the records that they needed because communist governments wouldn't let Western historians and investigators in. So a lot of the records in Prague, for example, in Moscow, in Kiev, they couldn't get to for years and years. So they suspected these men were here, and in some cases they knew it. But they didn't really understand the scope of Travniki, just how bad it was, because the records were locked away. They also had a lot of trouble here at home politically, because the Office of Special Investigation was going after old men who had aged gracefully, peacefully in the United States. And they faced incredible political backlash from top people, including Pat Buchanan, who tried to shut down the Office of Special Investigations many times, both while he was a columnist and when he was Reagan's communications director in the White House. A number of prominent journalists wanted this unit closed. So they not only couldn't get to the records because they were behind lock and key in Soviet-controlled archives, they then faced backlash here at home from people, including very prominent people, who said, "Why are you prosecuting old men? Let this die." They also faced backlash from Germany and Austria, because once they identified these men, Germany said, "We don't want our Nazis. We don't want these Nazis back. You keep them," you know? And so the State Department had to get involved, and the Office of Special Investigations spent years trying to convince Germany and Austria to take their Nazis back. In fact, one of their prosecutors, a man named Michael Bernstein from Bethesda, Maryland, Army, chauffeuring GIs to movies at night. And he went to dance halls and had a great time in post-war Munich. And then he realized, well, the Congress of the United States has passed this Displaced Persons Act. They're letting in war refugees. So he essentially masqueraded as a war refugee, and because US Army intelligence did not know about Travniki, he was let in. And in fact, the US government in the years after the war wasn't really big on looking for Nazi war criminals on US soil. They really weren't. They were too busy fighting the Cold War, not enough interest. It really wasn't until the late 1970s that a Jewish congresswoman in New York pressed the government to start searching for war criminals, Nazi war criminals on US soil. And not only to start searching, but to create a unit inside the criminal division of the US Department of Justice. So she threw the weight of the criminal division of the Justice Department behind this effort, but it did not start until the 1970s, late 1970s. In fact, the thinking among Peter Black and Eli Rosenbaum and the other people in this book was that they'd be on the job for a year or two. They'd find the people they needed to find, and a year or two later, they'd be done and looking for work. They lasted 30 years looking for Nazi war criminals, 30 years, racing against the clock because witnesses were growing older and dying. The people they were trying to prosecute were growing older and dying. And so they thought it would be a 1 or 2 year thing, and it was 30 years, and they eventually were able to prosecute well over 100 people. But to answer your question, they didn't know about Travniki.
Let's head right up here, right in the middle.
Once they found the Nazis living here in the United States, why was it so important for the Office of Special Investigations to deport them rather to bring them to justice here in front of all the survivors?
Yep. They couldn't, is the short answer. The Constitution prohibited the Office of Special Investigations from bringing criminal charges against war criminals for crimes committed on foreign soil. So they couldn't go after them in criminal court. They could not have a war crimes trial in the United States. It would have required a change in the Constitution. There was not a lot of push for that at the time, and they were racing against the clock. So the only avenue they had was to take these men to court in a civil denaturalization and deportation case. That was the only avenue they had. They would have loved to go after them in criminal court. And the goal was to deport them and have countries like Germany, Israel, Austria try them. There wasn't a lot of will for that, especially in Germany and Austria, just not a lot of will. So the only avenue they had was to remove them from US soil. And they had mixed results because of the pushback.
We've got a question right down here in the second row.
Is the Office of Special Operations under the Justice Department still operating under the present administration?
It merged with a broader war crimes unit, and so now there might be another Nazi investigation going on that I don't know about, but they've broadened their mission to include war criminals from other countries. So Bosnia, Guatemala, other hotspots around the world. And it's kind of sad if you think about it. They were trying to do this to show the world that there is going to be justice if you come to the United States. We will track you no matter how many years have passed. They did this because they were hoping to show the world that, you know, there's accountability for horrific acts, and yet they're just as busy as ever trying to get war criminals from other countries removed from US soil. They're no longer called the Office of Special Investigations. It's a broader unit now. They've expanded their mission post-World War II.
Right back here.
Your subject matter brings to mind the Simon Wiesenthal organization, and the absence of your referring to them. Perhaps you could amplify on what they've done and your relationship with them.
Yes. So Simon Wiesenthal is, of course, considered the most successful Nazi hunter in the world. And early on, he provided a tip to the Justice Department that helped fuel the push in the United States to create a Nazi hunting unit. He found that there was a woman living in New York who had once been known she had worked at the Medill concentration camp right outside of Lublin. And she wore these special boots with like studs under them because she would kick prisoners and beat them to death with her boots. They called her Stomping Mare. And she did horrific things to children, very brutal things to children. And she ended up marrying an American GI and living as a housewife, I think in Queens, New York. Simon Wiesenthal tracked her down, passed along the tip to the Justice Department, and that led in part to the creation of the Office of Special Investigations.
We've got a question in the back over here. Do you mind passing that over to her?
100 men were deported. Their families remain on U.S. soil, correct? And are they known of? Has anything been done in terms of just identifying these people? Because I would think that in many cases there was some foreknowledge as to what they had done.
That's a very smart question. You know, the Office of Special Investigations really tried to keep the families, especially the children, out of it. In a lot of cases, the children didn't even know about their parents' histories there. In some cases, like in the John Demjanjuk case, perhaps the best known case in the United States, his children got involved and worked very forcefully to defend their father. But in most of these cases, families remained quiet. They didn't even know about the histories. And the Office of Special Investigations focused on the perpetrator, not their families.
And we've got a question all the way over there. Hallie's coming to you with the mic.
First of all, let me thank you for the work that you've done. My wife is the daughter of a Polish-Jewish Holocaust survivor, and every day I look at my children and I think, how can we keep history alive, and how can we continue to educate people on how quickly hate can spread? So thank you. My question is, to what extent has OSI worked in cooperation with the State of Israel and gotten assistance from the State of Israel in their investigations and prosecutions?
Yeah, that's also a good question. They did at times get a lot of cooperation from Israel, especially at the beginning in the John Demjanjuk case, which is a long, winding story. They thought he was Ivan the Terrible of the Treblinka death camp. They got it wrong. Israel tried to prosecute, ultimately dropped the case against Demjanjuk. But they did get cooperation over the years from Israel. But mostly, it was a US-based operation. And other countries, like Canada, actually modeled Nazi hunting units after the Office of Special Investigations. So other countries were modeling the work of the Office of Special Investigations. But it was mostly a US-based operation. And their operation took off after communism collapsed, and they were able to get into Kiev and Moscow, Warsaw, other cities, and look at these troves of Nazi records that no one had ever seen before.
We have time for one last question. Afterwards, please join us in the lobby for a book signing with Debbie. Let's go right back here.
Yes, many of us are aware of the Nazis from the concentration camps, but how about the new surge of Nazism in this country today? What are we doing about that?
That's quite a question to end on, and I appreciate that question because it's an important one. I think yesterday was just the 1 year of the Tree of Life in Pittsburgh, and we all know that there is a rise in anti-Semitism in the United States. There's a rise in hate crimes in the United States, not just against the Jewish community, but the immigrant community and other communities here. And so, you know, I don't know that I can answer your question, but I can tell you that I was moved by the Nazi hunters in this book because they had no tolerance for intolerance. They had no appetite for it, and they spent their entire lives trying to root it out of this country. And they did that because, as we all know, history repeats. And they wanted to make a statement that this is not a country that will accept that no matter how many years has passed. And so, like this gentleman over here with children, I wrote this book for my kids, for my children. it's a new day, and there are things that they need to know about and be aware of. This country is definitely shifted a little bit, and I hope that books and books like this will do some good. I hope you'll read it. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.